Hello, what's up everyone? Welcome back. So now we're gonna look at strict liability. Without further ado, let's go. Okay, strict liability is a type of offense that only requires proving actus reus. In other words, it is punishable per se. You don't need to prove the element of mens rea or the guilty mind for a conviction to be successful. So, this type of liability, which is strict liability, is reserved only for offences where responsibility is expected regardless of mental state. So that's basically what I've just touched on just now lah. Okay, so in the case of Malan bin Abdullah, the court held that in cases of strict liability, actus reus is sufficient for conviction without needing to prove mens rea. Okay, the general rule in criminal conviction is mens rea is automatically presumed unless statutes leave it out. This has been reaffirmed in the case of Brand against Wood. Okay, and now we are looking at how mens rea is presumed. So mens rea is generally only presumed for truly criminal offences. That means other offences, including strict liability, does not automatically presume mens rea, because then it's like a secular argument lah. It doesn't need to presume mens rea in the first place because it's a strict liability, and it's a strict liability because these offences do not need to have the presumption of mens rea. Okay, what is the rationale of strict liability offences? It is actually just to promote greater vigilance. So, bayangkan, one example of strict liability offence is, if I'm not mistaken, contoh langgar lampu merah. You don't need to You don't need to have a mens rea to say that langgar lampu merah ni adalah sesuatu yang salah, because it is actionable per se. You can bring a conviction just due to the fact that actus reus, which is the guilty act of langgar lampu merah tu, has been established. You don't need to prove that there is a guilty mind along with it. Okay, so how do courts determine strict liability offences? Basically, they look at statutory terms, and this thing is established in the case of Osman bin Abu Hamid. Okay, in this case, the accused was guilty for strict liability offences because mens rea was excluded from the legislation. Legislation. Sorry. Okay. So what are the criteria of determining strict liability offences? It's basically the criteria of social and public welfare. We can see this in the case of Lim Chin Ai, which states that the protection of public welfare alone justifies strict liability offences. Because in this case, the accused was selling food, and since he was a food vendor, he has the presumed responsibility of ensuring that the food he sells is free of any dangerous substances macam bacteria, things like that lah. So because he did not follow those regulations, the fact that he didn't follow, regardless of his mental state, regardless of his intention of doing it, his knowledge of doing it, he is still liable for merely not following those guidelines. So what are the possible defences if you are faced with a strict liability offence charge? Firstly, you can say there is a mistake of fact. This is in section 79 of the Penal Code, as well as the case of Abdullah against R. So in this case, Abdullah against R was in the good faith of believing that he was dealing with someone who was 16 years old, but the person was in fact not 16 years old, but he was in the good faith of believing that, I can't remember he or she lah, the person was 16 years old. So because of that, there was a mistake of fact, hence why he can use, the court considered that as a defense in strict liability offences. Secondly, the mistake of accident. This is in section 80 of the Penal Code, and it basically states that you accidentally did the strict liability offence lah, macam tu. So that is it. I think not much. I think this is basically the shortest video I've done ever. So that's about it. See ya.